Hello there, it's Silver. This is Avowed. So, Avowed is a first-person action RPG developed by Obsidian, and it's set in Obsidian's Pillars of Eternity universe. And there is something kind of novel about seeing a CRPG world rendered in first person instead, since you're usually so far away from them. It's kind of neat. And the first thing to say would probably be that this is not a CRPG. So if you're expecting that because it's set in the same universe as Pillars of Eternity, then it's not quite that complex. It doesn't go for that level of complexity or that level of build variety in your characters. It is still an RPG. It has plenty of RPG elements, but it's not as crunchy in numbers and stuff as like a proper full CRPG is. So, first thing, how it looks and sounds. Well, they've obviously put a tremendous amount of work into how this game looks. They seem to be quite proud of it. In fact, if you look at the Steam page, a lot of the description is bragging about how it looks, basically. And to be fair, they do deserve that, because it is a beautiful game to look at. Pillars of Eternity was already a very good-looking world. They had a really cool art style with those games, because the world is very much like a lot of earth tones and stuff, but then it's accentuated by these really bright pops of color everywhere. So there's tons of like super bright greens and purples and reds and stuff in the environment that really make it stand out a lot. That's just how the Pillars of Eternity games look. They're extremely colorful games, and this game takes that art style and runs with it. So you're going to be exploring these very neutrally toned environments that are filled with these really bright, vivid colors everywhere that make everything just look really good. The game in general just looks fantastic, and if you crank everything up to max with all of its ray tracing and stuff like that, it definitely looks extremely good. Even reflections, lighting and shadows, all that stuff, it definitely looks extremely high fidelity. The thing that I was personally looking for were the combat effects, because in Pillars of Eternity, the way combat looks is really flashy and cool. It's very visceral looking. Magic looks like the characters are barely controlling it. It's like really colorful and violent looking. And they did actually transfer that to this game pretty well. All the magic stuff is super bright colors and kind of looks like you're just barely controlling the forces of nature. It's a cool effect, and I think they've done a good job of transitioning that, the combat feedback and the combat look of the CRPGs into this. In terms of how it sounds, this is another one of the things that I was looking for, because the combat sounds in Pillars of Eternity help to convey a certain sense of weight and power to your swings and stuff. Combat sounds visceral and sounds really good in that game, or both of those games really, and it sounds very similar here. They've taken the lessons, I suppose, that they learned from making very visceral sounding combat and transferred it to a first-person perspective, and it works well. Combat sounds very good. It adds a lot of weight and impact to your swings, even if you're using something like a wand, which in some games sounds kind of puny and not very satisfying. It actually sounds like you're really hitting things pretty hard in this game, and they've managed to create a combat soundscape that sounds violent and very chaotic, and I think that fits with the game's visuals and stuff because of the very chaotic colors and everything. It matches quite well, actually, and it makes the combat feel that little bit extra more satisfying. Musically, the game has a pretty nice score. I haven't found any tracks that like super stood out to me as incredible or anything, but I think that it all fits well with the universe and is good music as a backdrop for your adventure. It's very much like, fantasy RPG adventuring music, the kind. It's that. So even though none of it has stood out to me as exceptional, I think it is a fine soundtrack that meshes well with the game's visuals and overall sort of adventuring aesthetic. Mechanics-wise, even though this is a more streamlined experience than a full CRPG is, there's still quite a lot to talk about, because the combat takes up most of what you're going to be doing in-game. There's a lot of exploration and a good amount of dialogue as well, but you are fighting a lot, so most of the mechanics are based around combat. Notably, this game does not use a Vancian magic system where you have spell slots and a certain number of uses per slot. Instead, you have an MP gauge called Essence that is used for both spells and abilities. Any sort of weapon skills and things, they all use this Essence meter, so it's an important resource for every build of character, not just mages. One thing I like actually about the health and essence management in this game is the way food works. So you'll find lots of food and drink items, of course, to take into your inventory and fill your pockets with. And when you eat or drink something, it will restore a certain amount of health or essence or both. But the way that it works is it actually adds the restoration as sort of a buff to your character, which means once you've maxed out your meters, the buff remains. So if something restores 100 health and you only have 50 health missing, then it will keep a buff of 50 health worth of restoration in reserve, so that when you take more damage, then it will start restoring it again. So this means you can use food and drink in a way that you don't waste any of it. You always keep the excess amount that you didn't need as sort of a buff that will affect yourself later. When you're outside of combat, food and drink restores your resources very, very quickly, but when you're in combat, food restores your stuff really slow. So it's useful to have in combat because it gives you a constant regeneration of your resources, but it is not something that you can rely on if you're being continually hit, because it's too slow for that. There are health and essence potions you can get, and these restore your resources much, much more quickly, but of course are more rare and expensive than food. But not by too much, honestly. The main limiting factor with potions is the fact that merchants don't stock very many of them at once, maybe like 4 or 5 oftentimes. Any merchant that sells potions will have about that many to sell at any given time, and you'll have to wait for a refresh for them to have more. But you will, if you're exploring a lot, you will find plenty of them in the environment, so you'll still have plenty of potions. You have a set of basic attacks depending on what kind of weapon you have equipped. There are quite a few different weapon types, each with their own characteristics, from long swords, great swords, maces, axes, great axes, hammers, wands, and various types of guns, because of course in the Pillars of Eternity universe they do have firearms, even though they're primitive firearms. So you've got like arquebus, pistols, and some other things like that. And you've also got some offhand only items like shields and grimoires that allow you to cast spells out of them even if you don't have those spells memorized to your character. Although it's cool the way that it works if you do spend points on memorizing those spells so that you can actually cast them from your character without a grimoire, then casting them through a grimoire will cast them at 1 rank higher than you normally can. So grimoires are always useful even if you have high level spells on your skill bar, because they allow you to cast a more powerful version of all those spells. Most weapons also have a power attack or a charge attack of some kind that does a lot of extra damage. Enemies do have a sort of stagger gauge-like mechanic where you can hit them with various things and this gauge will build up, and once it maxes out they'll get stunned for a while, and while they're stunned you can use any weapon that you have to do a sort of big finisher attack on them. It's not always an instant kill, but it does a ton of damage, and it's usually really flashy looking. In fact, in general, I would say the combat is very well animated. The animations, both for first person and for the animations of your enemies and stuff, are all really good looking, and your companions as well. They are clearly like mocapped animations and stuff, so they are very detailed and good looking. I would say this is highly ability-focused combat, by which I mean you'll be doing plenty of damage with your basic weapon attacks, but what you really want to be doing is cycling through your various abilities, and when they're off cooldown, making sure to use them on a good rotation and stuff, and keeping your essence meter up so that you can keep using them, because that's where the majority of your big burst damage and a lot of your utility and defensive skills and stuff, all that is going to come from your abilities and spells. So it's pretty fun combat in general, and it's based on this sort of tier system. Basically, all equipment that you can equip, weapons and armor, as well as all enemies, have a tier, 1 through 4 or 5, and this tier has 3 ranks each. So on your equipment, you'll have these little chevron symbols that represent like +1, +2, or +3 gear of a certain tier. And then once you get +3 of a certain tier, you can rank up to the next tier up. So tier 1 +3 will turn into tier 2 if you upgrade it again, and then it'll just keep going from there. And 1 tier is a very large difference in power or protective capability in terms of armor. And enemies also use the same tier system, although instead of chevrons they use skulls. So like a 3 skull tier 2 enemy is more powerful than a 0 skull tier 2 enemy. This is basically the replacement for the idea of level scaling. This game does not have any sort of level scaling. Instead, everything has this tier system. So if you're facing off against tier 3 enemies, but you have tier 1 armor and tier 1 weapons, then you're going to be doing very pitiful damage to them, and they're probably going to kill you in like 2 hits. So you need to upgrade your gear in order to go up against them. So this is just a sort of general way to tell you how strong roughly you should be to fight in that area. All equipment can be upgraded at camp. You can make camp at these Audra pillars, the big green crystals. And at camp you can do things like cook food and upgrade your gear, and there are lots of upgrade materials in the environment that can be used for this purpose. And once you of course upgrade your gear to +3, you can then spend a whole bunch of materials to upgrade it to the next tier up. But in terms of legendary stuff, unique gear, the unique stuff that you can find around the world as like rare loot, that stuff takes Audra, so like a rare drop resource, in order to upgrade from tier to tier. So if you want to keep your legendary stuff actually competitive with the higher tier enemies, then it takes a much more rare resource to do so. Leveling up gives you an attribute point to spend on one of your attributes, and there are several, and they tend to affect multiple things at once, and they're useful for pretty much everyone. Like, it seems like every attribute is somewhat general, so that they all have a use with different builds. Like, say, might isn't the same thing as strength. Strength would only be useful for like physical damage builds, and something like a wizard wouldn't spec into strength at all because it'd be useless for them. But in this case, might is just damage across the board with every type of weapon. So even wizards benefit from might. It also improves your carrying capacity, which is always useful if you're a pack rat, like me. And you also, of course, get a skill point, and there are several skill trees that are dependent on class. You don't actually choose a class when you create a character. You can spend any points in any class tree you want. You're not limited to any of them. They're just named after classes to sort of tell you what in general is going to be in them. So there's plenty of passive and active skills in these trees to make sure you have a pretty decent variety of builds for your character. Companions-wise, the game puts its best foot forward right from the start by giving you Kai as your first companion, who is a great character who's voiced by Garrus from Mass Effect, who does an excellent job and is a permanent addition to my party because he's great. But then you get Marius, who I find incredibly annoying and replaced as soon as I was able to do so. But for the most part, I think your companions are actually pretty good. They're well voice acted, with a couple of exceptions, and are fun to have in the party. And one thing I was really impressed by was how much dialogue your companions have, even for incidental stuff, like going into new areas. Side quests, lots and lots of side quests actually have unique dialogue from your companions, which is surprising. And tons of little discoveries in the world and, small events and things have dialogue as well. So your companions don't do the thing that sometimes happens in like open world RPGs where they say the same 5 lines over and over and you get kind of sick of it after a while. They tend to have a lot of unique dialogue in this case, which I definitely appreciate. Your companions have their own skills that you can tell them to cast whenever you want, sort of like a Dragon Age kind of setup, and they will also cast them by themselves if the opportunity is right. And as they venture with you, they'll level up too, and you can spend companion skill points on their own skill trees. They have a variety of different skills and upgrades to those skills that you can purchase with their own points to make them stronger. Although companion management is definitely heavily streamlined in compared to something like Pillars of Eternity, because you only have a small number of skills to purchase for them, and you also can't do things like change their equipment or anything of that sort. Also, as you're adventuring, sometimes important things will happen. It could be the end of a certain side quest, or it could be the end of a certain main quest, or anything like that, really. And then this little symbol will appear on the left side of the screen that tells you they have something to say to you. So the next time you're at camp, you can talk to them, and they'll have some unique dialogue talking about what happened and what your decision was and stuff like that. And sometimes these conversations will end with a bit of character growth, and you can actually get some permanent stat bonuses and stuff from doing this. So I think the companion system is pretty well realized. It may be simplified in comparison to a CRPG, but it's still pretty solid, and it helps that the companions are very well voice acted for the most part and fun to have around. Also, as a little aside, sometimes when you are exploring in very out-of-the-way places, you can find these totem things that are related to certain gods, and you can find these fragments of those totems in other places that are also related to that same god, and you can go back to your camp and plop the totems down on this big stump and then put the fragments in it, and you will get like several levels worth of stat bonuses permanently from doing this. So this is a huge reason to explore in really out-of-the-way areas, because these are really beneficial effects that you can find just by scrounging around. Story-wise, without any spoilers, of course, it's actually a pretty interesting setup, but I think the most interesting parts of it are the sort of background things that are happening, and not as much the main questline stuff that's happening, by which I mean the sort of lore behind what's happening is actually pretty cool. So you are a godlike in this game, which in the Pillars of Eternity universe is a person blessed by a god at birth in some way that marks their face with various growths and things that sort of tell other people that they've been touched by a god in some way. But you don't know who your god is. Usually a godlike will have dreams about their god like immediately upon birth, so that they automatically know whose godlike they are, but you don't. You also have a voice in your head that talks to you sometimes, and this voice is a little bit confusing at times. It speaks in a very poetic way that's very non-literal and very figurative, so it's kind of hard to discern exactly what it's talking about sometimes, but you can figure it out once you talk to it for long enough. And the voice also seems to be an interesting combination of very old and wise, and also kind of young and confused at the same time. One touch that I really liked is that whenever you sleep at a camp, this voice will sometimes talk to you and talk to you about specific decisions that you've made in the story or in side quests, and you can sort of try to justify yourself to it, or talk about what else you could have done, or what other decisions you could have made, and how it affected the people around the quest line and stuff, which is a really cool touch. And it feels like you're teaching this voice something by doing all of that. Like, it learns from what you say and from the decisions you make, as if you're sort of shaping its understanding of the world by the decisions that you make while questing. This is also the kind of game, by the way, where side quests aren't exactly side quests in this case, because you kind of need to do a lot of them. If you just do the main quest line, you will quickly find that the enemies increase in tier and difficulty far faster than you increase in power, and will outpace you very fast. So if you don't do side content, then you'll find that the main quest line becomes almost impossible really quickly. Now, in some games I have a problem with this because the side quests can get repetitive or grindy and it becomes sort of an annoyance to have to do them, but in this game I actually don't mind as much because they've done a good job of making the side quests unique and interesting. Even something that starts as a simple fetch quest will often have some sort of payoff at the end that makes it worthwhile and makes it not quite so generic as it may have seemed at first. So that, combined with the fact that your companions often have a lot to say about these side quests and that the voice in your head also talks to you about them, it's all kind of comes together to mean that the side questing is actually really fun in this game. So the fact that you kind of need to do some of it to progress comfortably is actually a good thing in my opinion, because it gets you to explore the world a lot more and there's a lot of good stuff to see. So overall, I've had a really good time with Avowed. I've really enjoyed it, but it does have its shortcomings, and here's the big thing. This game is $70, and if you're going to charge that much for a game, then you've got to really justify the cost in some way, and I feel that very few games actually do so, and in this case, I don't really think that Avowed justifies a $70 price tag. I feel like it's totally fair to judge games like this very harshly if they're charging that much, and if you don't want your game judged very harshly, then maybe don't charge $70 for it. But there are cracks in the surface of this game. It has a very pretty facade, but there are some mechanical flaws and things that make me say that it's just not quite necessarily up to the standard that you would hopefully expect from a game of that price. For instance, the way that balance works is quite confusing. I mentioned that the main quest line becomes almost impossible very quickly if you don't do side content, and that's because the distribution of enemies and their tiers is really chaotic and weird. You'll enter an area that has tier 1 enemies, and then in the same encounter as those, you'll see like a tier 3 enemy or two that just sort of appears out of nowhere and chooses to fight you, and it's weird how difficult these encounters can get out of nowhere because they just sprinkle in these really high difficulty enemies in areas where everything else otherwise is more your level. And this problem gets worse as you go through the game, and tiers get higher and higher, and enemy health gauges get longer and longer, and it just becomes this really weird balancing act where it kind of feels like you can never really catch up to the enemy strength. Like you're always doing less damage than you feel you should, and you're always taking more damage than you feel you should, because the enemies are always outpacing you just a little bit. And it makes the balancing of the game overall feel a little bit chaotic and strange. But another big flaw for the game is that the world feels very static in this game, and I think that maybe this is where comparisons to Pillars of Eternity do it no favors, because that's a CRPG, and CRPGs have really rich, detailed worlds that are very reactive and very mechanically complex, and this game just doesn't really have that, so it feels immediately less than it could because it's compared to something far more complex. Adventuring around, you'll notice that there's lots of cool stuff to find, but there's also pretty much no NPCs wandering around doing their own things. You will never really come across groups of people doing things out in the world. It's mostly just you and enemies exploring, and that's pretty much it. If you go to towns, you'll notice that NPCs mostly stand in place, and they might have some unique dialogue, but they don't really go anywhere or do anything, and it makes the world feel a little bit hollow as a result. You'll notice things like if you walk into a shop and you see a couple of potions on the counter and some gold, you can just pick it up, and no one cares. There's no penalty, there's no such thing as stealing in this game. Everything is unowned. You can walk anywhere and lockpick anything and take anything you want. No one cares. And this all contributes to a world that feels unreactive and hollow in a way. It's a very pretty world, and it's a fun to explore world, mechanically speaking, in terms of combat and collectibles to find and stuff, but in terms of how it feels, how it reacts to the player, how the NPCs work and all that stuff, it all feels a little bit hollow. If this game were to be, say, $40 or $50, I would say that I wouldn't really have any problems with recommending it because it is fun enough. It's a good 7 out of 10 RPG that does a pretty good job, but it's $70, and I have a lot of problems recommending a game of that price that has these flaws. So to me, there are really two good options here. One, This is the kind of game that you wait for. It goes on sale and you get it on sale. This is definitely a sale kind of game because a sale will make its price a lot more reasonable, and I think that's probably a good thing to wait for. But the other option is that it's on Game Pass, and this is the kind of game that is perfect for Game Pass because it's just too expensive on its own, but on Game Pass it's a really good use of your time, and I feel that that's actually the perfect place to play it. In fact, that's how I'm playing it for this video. So overall, my verdict for Avowed is that it is a solid RPG that does a good job of being fun to explore and fun to fight in and things, and its characters are mostly good with a couple of exceptions, and its writing may be not as good as Pillars of Eternity, but it is still solid writing, if a little bit generic fantasy here and there, but suffers from a bit of a case of hollow world syndrome and being a lot more unreactive than the games that it shares a universe with. So definitely a sale pickup or a Game Pass pickup. I would say it's fun enough for that, and you'll probably have a good time with it. Don't pay full price for it though. I will put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Avowed if you wish to check it out yourselves. Maybe wishlist it so that if it goes on sale you're notified by email. That's a good idea. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.